So, what are those Russian Wunderwaffe, Oreshniks, and those things up to again? Russia attacked Ukraine with a powerful hypersonic missile called Oreshnik. Kyiv is burning. We talked about how Kyiv is burning and what's happening on the front line in the previous video, where I did a classic frontline update and described what was hit by what, how great the Russian attackers were, and how great the Ukrainian defenders were. That's what we discussed there. But now I would like to discuss the so-called Wunderwaffe, the holy trinity of missiles around which all sorts of rumors, mistakes, and myths are spreading on social media in the Czech Republic about what they actually are and how they work. Journalists who call the Oreshnik a hypersonic missile aren't helping either. I think there's a terrible mess in all of this, so today we could clarify a bit how, for example, the Oreshnik differs from the Kinzhal and how the Kinzhal differs from the Zircon, so we know what's what and so we don't keep posting complete nonsense on social media. Because it seems to me that people really don't even know how the Oreshnik works and they think it's just something that it isn't. And I think the media add a lot, really a lot to this. So we'll go through the Oreshnik, the Kinzhal, and the Zircon, but we'll start with the Oreshnik. And I think it's good to start by saying that it's a big mistake to call the Oreshnik a hypersonic missile. Because, of course, the Oreshnik does exceed Mach 5 at a certain stage. It even reaches Mach 10. But the problem is that all ballistic missiles designed to perform the same function as the Oreshnik reach these speeds. So, a ballistic missile that is originally intercontinental and then limited, for example, to continental range, has the same type of rocket engine as the Oreshnik and works on the principle that it flies into the upper layers of the atmosphere and then things happen there. Because at the moment when a ballistic missile is leaving almost the atmosphere of our planet, it almost always reaches speeds of Mach 5, Mach 8, Mach 10, because there's hardly any air resistance up there, and because the rocket engine still works in some way. But by definition, you can't call this a hypersonic missile, because what is the definition of a hypersonic missile? Because before, it was a very narrow definition that a hypersonic missile has to exceed Mach 5. Today, we have a slightly updated definition of a hypersonic missile. A proper hypersonic missile, first of all, exceeds Mach 5. Secondly, it is steerable and can change direction during its flight. And thirdly, it stays in contact with the operator throughout its flight, who can change its direction. So it can either be slightly corrected or it stays in contact with satellites. So these are the points that it has to meet. And as for the Oreshnik, it doesn't meet these criteria. That's a ballistic missile, which in reality, once it is launched, already has its trajectory set for where it should go. It flies into space, or rather into the upper layers of the atmosphere, and there it opens up, right? It opens up, and out of it, 6 more projectiles fall out, which then turn in the direction they need to, towards the places they're supposed to strike. So they aim, and then they open up, and from those 6 projectiles, or from those 6 containers, another 6 projectiles fall out, and those are then launched towards their targets. And then it looks like projectiles are coming down from the sky, and sometimes these are really just some metal rods or tungsten rods that look like these bands of fire. Because what is it? In reality, it's actually something like, I would almost say, a man-made micrometeorite or a swarm of micrometeorites, which fly through the atmosphere at tremendous speed, usually without any explosive warhead. And it's only their kinetic energy that causes this destructive force. It's really basically as if the place was hit by a swarm of asteroids or meteorites or some kind of microcomet or something like that. That's the Oreshnik's function. That's how the Oreshnik works. It's an inaccurate weapon, effective for destroying a fairly large area, which, it's true, exceeds hypersonic speed most of the time, but it's a ballistic missile that operates from space, and the projectiles fired from it hit the ground. Yeah, It's not some ultra modern thing. It's nothing groundbreaking. It's a completely normal Cold War thing, which is very common, and I wouldn't consider it something truly miraculous. Sure, there's a huge threat in that, and that's something many people underestimate. There's a huge threat in the fact that you have those 36 projectiles, that it's 6 times 6 projectiles, which are more or less impossible to shoot down projectiles, and suddenly you have all 36 of them at once. They fly very fast, and there are a lot of them. So the air defense really can't handle it properly. And most of the time it doesn't fly alone. Most of the time it's accompanied by some other missiles. Yeah? So what is Oreshnik good at? Oreshnik is effective because it overwhelms air defense, and at the same time it causes a huge psychological effect because you basically never know exactly where it will land. You can't really calculate where the missiles are aimed, and it's extremely difficult to defend against this. At the same time, it's good to realize that it's basically a space rocket, which is, well, it's just several meters long. There's fairly sophisticated electronics inside, although it's true that it's not exactly hypermodern, but there is fairly sophisticated electronics, various things like inertial guidance, which is part of it, and so on. And it takes several months to make and costs a lot of money. In the end, you can achieve much greater destruction by other means, even non-nuclear conventional means, for much less money, and the use of Oreshniks is more or less a matter of propaganda. And honestly, calling it a hypersonic missile is basically quoting Russian propaganda, but Russian propaganda doesn't really handle the term hypersonic very well. And the proof of that is another missile that the Russians call hypersonic, and that's the Kinzhal missile. The Kinzhal is nothing more than, if I'm not mistaken, an Iskander that's just slightly modified, has new little wings, a slightly modernized interior, and is mounted on a MiG-31K. And what is it at that moment? Well, it's not a hypersonic missile in the true sense of the word. It's an aeroballistic missile, right? It's not even a missile with a flat trajectory. It's a missile that you mount on a fucking fast fighter bomber, you fly it up 20 kilometers, then you release it, give it full throttle, right? You give it full throttle from those jet engines, then you release it, the rocket engine kicks in, and of course the speeds add up. So from Mach 2, you suddenly have Mach 5, and God knows how much more, just more than you need for hypersonic speed, sure. So it flies at hypersonic speed, but it flies on a ballistic trajectory, and you can perfectly calculate where it's going to land. Sure, the problem is that it flies really fast. The problem is that you have very little time to react, so shooting it down is still very difficult. On the other hand, it's not some hyper-modern, super duper weapon, mainly because you know that when this fighter bomber is flying, it's very likely carrying this missile, well, the Kinzhal ballistic missile, which gets extra speed and is then launched. Yeah, and at that moment, you can somehow prepare for it. So basically, the greatest strength of the Kinzhal missile is really its speed. However, calling it a hypersonic missile when it can't reach hypersonic speeds on its own and needs to be carried by a fighter jet and also needs to be launched into the thinner layers of the atmosphere. Moreover, it's a missile that slows down below hypersonic speed when it hits its target. Honestly, that's just a terrible distortion, a really bad distortion of the term of what hypersonic actually means. So what is Kinzhal in the end? It's an Iskander mounted on a fighter jet with slightly modified electronics and a guidance system. That's all. It's not some kind of miracle weapon. The biggest strength really is in how fast it is. But it's really nothing special. And then we have the famous Zircon here. Zircon, which also flew to Ukraine. I think there were 2 or 3 of them. It was either 2 Kinzhal and 3 Zircon missiles or 3 Zircon and 2 Kinzhal missiles. I'm not sure right now. But what is a Zircon missile? A Zircon missile is probably the closest thing to what we would call hypersonic, because it more or less operates on its own. It's a cruise missile, so it's not a ballistic missile like the previous two. It launches from a ship, not from the ground, but usually from a ship. But it doesn't need a fighter jet for that, and it doesn't fly into space. And what happens is that first the rocket engine ignites. The rocket engine carries the missile into the higher layers of the atmosphere where there is low air resistance. There, the so-called scramjet propulsion comes into play, which basically works by forcing and compressing air into a very narrow, specially shaped space, which then, through pressure and speed, generates heat. And then fuel is added, it's ignited, and it starts making a real mess. So in the end, it's a combination of rocket and scramjet propulsion. And this scramjet propulsion can accelerate the missile up to Mach 9, right? But at that moment, this Zircon gets surrounded by ionized gas, which isn't created, as is often said, by friction, but by the fact that the missile is flying so fast that it compresses the air in front of it, similar to a piston in an engine, even though it's not exactly the same, but similar to a piston in an engine. It compresses the air in front of it. The air can't escape fast enough, and it gets broken apart, right? The atoms, like O2, get broken apart, they get torn up, electrons are released, which creates an ionized layer, ionized gases around the missile, and as a result, the missile is surrounded by a plasma envelope. The Russians marketed this plasma envelope as something that would block enemy radars and therefore make the Zircon impossible to shoot down. The opposite occurred, ladies and gentlemen. Not only does it not block enemy radars, this plasma envelope shines like a beacon in the sky and tells the enemy exactly where it is so they can target it, and it also interferes with the missile's own radar and satellite guidance. So, the moment it reaches supersonic speed, it becomes uncontrollable, and in order to correct its course at the end of its flight, it has to slow down, or it slows down below hypersonic speed, and then it maneuvers at the last moment to hit its target. At that point, it can be shot down. It's vulnerable to being shot down by a Patriot. And that's the problem. The problem is that at the moment it has hypersonic speed, it becomes uncontrollable, which contradicts the very definition of a successful hypersonic missile, which must be controllable the entire time. And at the same time, it doesn't communicate with its operator, with its controller, with its command center, because it's shielded by that ionized envelope. And in order to accurately hit its target, it has to slow down and expose itself to the risk of being shot down. Which, as you can probably tell, isn't exactly the ultimate weapon. It's just not quite it. It's not really the definition of hypersonic, which means it exceeds Mach 5 the entire time, has to operate solely on its own engine without being lofted first, and can remain hypersonic all the way to the end. Because it can't remain hypersonic until the end. It can't. Because if it stayed hypersonic all the way to the end, first of all, in the lower layers of the atmosphere, it could easily break apart or get wrecked, because the way it's powered, that scramjet, is quite sensitive to shocks and certain airflows and so on, to changes in airflow. So at that point, the superjet, the scramjet, could totally break down. And at the same time, it wouldn't be able to aim properly. And you might ask, okay, so if you can't do it that way, if you can't use radar, why not use a satellite? Well, a satellite works exactly the same way as radar. Its signal also can't reach the missile when it's surrounded by that ionized gas. So you might ask, all right, what about inertial guidance? Inertial guidance is great. Yeah, you put various sensors and gyroscopes and these kinds of things into the missile. You set where it should go and it calculates it. The computer calculates it for it and it just goes there. But here again, the problem is that inertial guidance is inaccurate. It's inaccurate. There are micro deviations, but there are micro deviations. And at those high speeds, when it's not possible to correct it from satellites or by radar or remotely in general, those microscopic deviations can end up causing the missile to miss by several meters. Which, at that moment, when it's designed as an anti-ship missile, but now they're using it against cities, yeah, so if it flies a bit off, it's probably not a problem, but it's still bad to hit a kindergarten when you're aiming for an ammunition depot, you know. It happens, but at that moment, when there's that small deviation and you can't correct it, you just end up missing, which is a problem because the Zircon doesn't contain any extremely powerful or large explosive warhead, you know. But of course, it causes huge damage just by its speed alone. That's also true. Anyway, people often ask, okay, what about laser guidance? So the problem with laser guidance is that the temperatures generated during the flight of a hypersonic missile would melt the optics. So it would be inaccurate. Actually, the only way Zircon could work as a real hypersonic missile would be if the Russians managed to develop a new frequency for their radars that could penetrate the ionized envelope, work at longer distances, and not be blocked by clouds. That's the current problem, because we can create a radar that can communicate through that ionized envelope, but only at a short distance and in ideal weather conditions, which mostly only works over the sea and isn't really practical when you want to use missiles in combat operations. Here's the thing. I'm not saying that weapons like Oreshnik, Kinzhal, and Zircon are junk. Not at all. Not at all. You can see that it causes huge tragedies, massive damage, and it's really unpleasant. However, as many people say, that it's some kind of super weapon that's miles ahead technologically compared to what we have in the West, well, it's not, right? It's just that the Russians decided to lower the requirements for what they want from their hypersonic missiles, and they call something a hypersonic missile that we would say, dude, we're not going to use this junk, that's not a proper hypersonic missile. Maybe that's our problem, that we want things to be too reliable and too functional, while the Russians just say, ha! Sure, it doesn't work the way it should, but hey, to some extent it can fly fast, so I guess that's better than if it flew slowly the whole time. It doesn't fit the definition, but we'll still call it that. However, calling Zircon or Kinzhal a hypersonic missile is just as nonsensical as calling ballistic missiles hypersonic missiles, right? The fact that it flies at Mach 5 or more for a while doesn't make it a hypersonic missile. That's just propaganda nonsense from Moscow. Well, so that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I will definitely make more detailed, edited, and expert videos on the topic of Russian missiles and Russian weapons. That's the plan. However, let me know in the comments how you perceive it. How do you feel about all of this? What other nonsense have you heard on the internet about the mighty, great, amazing, divine missile Oreshnik, which is supposed to solve everything here for us? What I mean is like above, like Nutella, you know what I mean? Well, never mind. Which will just stir everything up here. Yeah, see you in the next videos. Check out the frontline updates, keep following me, join the streams where this video was made, write in the chat, and yeah, we're definitely going to keep going.